Hello everyone, today we talk about the fabliau, a particular medieval French literary genre that is a bit difficult to frame. I would define it like a third estate literary genre, which makes it sort of a bit more relatable than others considering at least the current times, and that historians of literature have a bit struggled to sort of frame better for the simple reason that, of course, traditional thinking, you shouldn't think about estates merely as classes, and so something that just pertains to unblock, right, to one or the other, and or that the same people cannot sort of rise or descend, and they're as the organic, corporative, universal part of the whole hierarchy, in which no estate could function without the other. So let's introduce this genre because it's not really a history of literature per se, but of course we try to give the broader meaning that belongs to the traditional, just the traditional reality to this. The fabliaux are concentrated essentially in northern France. They're langue d'oil literature. Linguistically, and spanning mostly the 13th and the early 14th centuries, which also as a chronological indicator is quite important because, we talk about it in the many videos about the Capetian monarchy during this point, to the booming, first of all, of the greater medieval civilization, and specifically to a country that witnesses a great deal of development, also urbanly speaking, albeit being mostly a feudal country, in which the third estate is ever more framed by the monarchy to work, to operate, to participate, right, in this expanding system, mostly in the administration, with the bourgeois essentially being subcontracted the government of some minor realities that still, however, are connected with the king, and therefore represent, if you want, a counter-altar to the nobility to some extent. And this could be already a very important key of interpretation. As the expression of... and then, of course, we know that in the mid-14th century things collapse. The third estate of course does exist, but it sort of becomes more oligarchic within itself. There are more patricians that are connected, with the higher oligarchy of the higher estates, but you don't have that sort of thriving, if you want, average sort of commoner or bourgeois, say better, expression like of ideas of participation to politics, and so on. That's why, in my opinion, this genre essentially pertains mostly to this time and place. The fabliaux are, we could say, primarily, in a formal sense, brief and essentially comedic tales. Right? That's the actual content. It's a more vulgar sort of literature than the sort of more circulating one. At least in written form, there is all an oral tradition that unfortunately we lost to a great extent. The fabliaux are written in the octosyllabic rhymed couplets that were really the standard narrative form of the time, so they just fit this normal metrics. So they were more conventionally accessible, right? And this is a very French type of literature, because there's been a debate, scholarly, regarding how, let's say, the fabliaux could sort of incorporate other works, such as, for example, Chaucer's contemporary tales, and even sort of wanting them to be part of the fabliaux tradition, which is incorrect. At least today, the fabliaux is defined as more accurately and exclusively as this corpus of French texts that, as we'll see now, have been selected with some careful research, because it's not entirely clear really what boundary you can give them, but definitely the more precise terminology is more restrictive. And of course, if you read the contemporary tales or, I don't know, Boccaccio's novels, so you can, of course, think of, say, similarities with the French Fabliaux, but they really fall into some sort of different, properly continuistic approach and style that is, as we will see, a bit more vulgar and even less elaborated to some extent in terms of literary refinement to this other, as also more famous authors that therefore were bringing really a lot into that. And it's not to say that the Fabliaux are some sort of lower type of literature per se, but generally speaking, as we will see, they are defined mostly by a specific type of content, if anything. We have over 40 extant manuscripts preserving Fabliaux from this timeline. Some feature a single tale alongside texts from other genres. So this is normal because they could be sort of literary collections and they're not meant to be just as a whole corpus. Others are instead veritable comprehensive collections of the same Fabliaux, which naturally favors, makes it easier to define what a Fabliaux is. We have one manuscript preserved at the National Library of Paris, the French manuscript 837, containing around 60 of these Fabliaux, right, which is really a lot, and as we will see, accounting for almost half, right, of the entirely recognized, at least Fabliaux, of course, extant Fabliaux production. The conceptions of Fabliaux were sort of molded historiographically. We'll talk now about some authors. The first one is Joseph Bédier, who studied the Fabliaux in a work dated 1893. And he basically identifies what I was talking about before, that is to say, the correlation between the rise of the genre and the growth of French cities, and so also the parallel emergence of a thriving bourgeoisie, right? In powerful political, cultural, and literary terms, because of the role that we've seen the bourgeois having in Capetian administration. Unlike other countries in Europe, of course, the term bourgeoisie could be sort of debated. I normally use it, but of course, France had a specific type of bourgeoisie. Of course, it's also the country that created the term. But let's say, as we were saying, I don't know, in England, there was a slightly different type of the same bourgeoisie, if you want to call them like that. In Italy, also another one. So the Fabliaux are particularly French in this background, in this context. So Bédier believed, as we'll see, there are different opinions that were at some point essentially debunked, that the courtly traditions were sort of rigidly separated from the bourgeois one. Because it wouldn't deny completely, of course, there was an exchange that we'll see now, but the idea is that the courtly romances, cultivated lyric poetry, delay, were all genres just pertaining to the court, the nobility, whatever. And so that the bourgeois public would essentially consume this other type of literature, and it was it. And so the Fabliaux would be, again, something that wouldn't make it to the course. This is really not correct. But the original connection with the bourgeoisie is not really classist, right? There is some, again, peculiar connection with the third estate and its values, its ideas, and so on. Then I will make a video about the various estates at some point, to define them a bit better in their traditional meaning. This interpretation his conception of the origins and audiences provided at least a convenient explanation for the apparent lack of literary pretensions in the Fabliaux that objectively do separate them from like a courtly situation in which like these works would have been used to promote values that were shared, like also in a almost institutional way, like courtly literature in general had been, like the general themes, the knights, the dames, the say chivalry, courtly love, angelic love, etc. The Fabliaux objectively doesn't say seem to care very much about that sort of the courtly milieu for the sake of authorial promotion. So it was believed at this point that the Fabliaux was essentially just like a middle class or peasantry literature or something that would be consumed mostly in those estates. This is also, again, not essentially correct. There is especially a vulgarity in the Fabliaux, as we'll see now, frankness in sexual and linguistic matters, like with great irreverence and also often coarse humor. And they are very heavy, as we will see now. They're also very funny in many ways, but of course they speak of sort of to a lower audience in some ways. Yet the initial scholarly mistake was to simply pretend that since, of course, this was not courtly romance, like this type of text wouldn't circulate in the courts as well, and so it was sort of a classist division. The same idea, this is really typical of late 19th century authors, like that everybody comes to criticize them because they were too, stereotypical, and then sort of the wave of actually classist people came, and then we began to debunk the latter, and we realized that the first guys actually were fundamentally right. Were often also more cultured people. In fact, if you read Bédier, of course, he was well aware that this separation was not that rigid, right? While he acknowledged that the Fabliaux were enjoyed in courtly circles himself, his distinction between the courtly and bourgeois literature is not just a dominant feature of his work, but fundamentally spot on. In general, Bédier's work was, however positive, was recognized for a long time. The main criticism or challenge came in 1957 by the work of Per Nicroc, and he would actually and unavoidably develop the same theory of Bédier on the Fabliaux. Nicroc disagreeing essentially just with, importantly now, however, with the notion that the genre emerged from a bourgeois mentality, right? This is actually, as we will see now, in turn criticizable because, yes, again, it sounded at least like to maybe like you see how weird the post-traditional thing is. You must criticize things just for the sake of it, not listening to what the elderly really said, for which reason, right? And of course, Nicroc, as the same Bédier had also pointed out already, identified specific situations and formulae in the Fabliaux that would have actually fitted a courtly audience, right? And so Nicroc went as far as saying that the Fabliaux would essentially even criticize courtly milieu, exploiting or parodying the same courtly literature and milieu, right? Which, in a sense, would contextualize them also into a courtly dimension and rejecting the purely bourgeois nature of the saying that had been believed up to that point, but more or less consensually. And this goes as far as considering partly the fabliau, therefore, as a courtly literature, just like the romances or the lay, right? And of course, as we'll see now, like there are courtly themes. There is, of course, a reference to the courtly world to a degree, and we can even think that these works did circulate in the courts, because, of course, these were complex places, and it happens at many levels, like in every society. There's not a rigid separation between the kind of literature that circulates. Everybody's more or less aware of sort of the more vulgar stuff, even though there is an etiquette or some higher standards. Again, they needed one another to exist, but they also were sort of separated. And in fact, Nick Rogg's theory proved to be actually way more rigid than Badier 1, right? Many fabliaux do not reflect courtly ideals or language, right? Even when they're intended as a parody. And so their entirety actually doesn't tell us that this wasn't actually a third estate thing, right? It is true that the scope of fabliaux subjects and techniques is dramatically broad. And in fact, as we will see now, a great deal of about the definition of this genre was, okay, but what texts are we specifically talking about? We find really a lot of stuff like linguistic playfulness, complex comedic development, straightforward anecdotes, simply lewd humor, right? So all things that can mix differently in different authors, right? So surely some fabliaux may fit like a courtly context of some degree. They would have circulated at court, but the various courts, especially at this time, but there is at least no doubt that the context for which, for example, like the crudest sexual jokes, while maybe surely circulating in discourse, were not actually designed for the courtly occasion and general context, right? Also, we find, as Jean Richtner found out in the 60s of the 20th century, that there are multiple variants of the same fabliau, right? And that this difference was based on was tailored on the narrative or language adaptation relative to the different type of milieu and audience, which also shows how sort of popular these fabliaux were, a bit like at all level of society, as we've seen important differences, but that required also this adaptation in order to be presented to different contexts. So again, what is also a definition of fabliau? We're not really going to attempt this, because it turns out that basically every scholar gave it a different one, all right? Bédier said that fabliaux are comic tales in verse. Point. At the same time, it doesn't seem particularly generous towards the actual artistic depth and, say, cultural value and social meaning of these texts, right? Comic tales in verse. Basically, you're just saying, yes, they're comedic verses. That's it. Stories that have more or less this type of metric and content. But then, right, what are they more concretely about? Also, what about their comedic content itself? Like, are the fabliaux simply humorous, right? Yeah, are they... it's not that easy to explain even by that what the fabliaux are concretely about. Because some of these texts are not merely humorous, not necessarily prevalently so. For example, we would have to exclude, at least according to this categorization, anything that we would see as primarily moralistic instead, and there are quite moralistic fabliaux that maybe also are humorous, but are not maybe like primarily so. These are the problems of the post-Linnean world, but the scholars did discriminate the fabliaux also on this basis, so excluding some of these because of such definition. There is an example, the la partie, which is often omitted from the fabliaux corpus, despite its cleverness and similarities to the other fabliaux. And only why? Because it's like tendentially a more serious kind of work than a humorous one. Also, again, some scholars include among the fabliaux a few works that use humor to make a serious moral point, and there is, as we'll see now, like a core of works that scholars sort of agree on being fabliaux that contain some of these uncontroversially, and so even if there is something else to it. We have the deux vilains qui conquis par plaie, for example, in which the protagonist cleverly argues his way into heaven by pointing out that the sins of those already there, such as Peter would deny his Lord, are far more egregious than his own. And this obviously is kind of a severe degradation of the actual theological understanding, which can be seen as an expression of the third estate that would consider, very almost economically the kind of matters as sin and salvation. A knight would have never sort of conceptualized the term in this way. It may be no coincidence in this regard that knights are often not figuring in the fabliaux. Unlike you can say, of course, the nobility or knights as well, but at this point, as we've seen in other videos, there was an increasing division between sort of the oligarchy and the average knight that was still the backbone of the French military. This would go on over time, but here we're talking mostly about the literal gentrification and softening of the establishment of the elites. And so the same bourgeois felt something in common probably with the same courtly realities in which, actually, of course, the nobility was heavily militarized, but was displaying already some sort of slight changes after this gigantic monarchic expansion, the level in which the same, as we've seen, bourgeois were co-opted by the monarchy to counter, if you want, and criticize, maybe in this sense, part of the nobility. So these aspects do not have to be underappreciated. We should skip this entire issue of the categories, because in many ways it's not useful, as you understood, to really qualify the fabliaux. We see different terminology used at the same time, by the way, to describe certain works that we count as fabliaux today, but that at the time were not really intended as that. Again, and welcome to the pre-Linnean world, in which it was not really important to categorize something just to make it be, right? But I say this because it could happen to you to find different, let's say, the medieval source tells you that this is, a fable, a conte, that is like a story or a tale, or a dit, that is a short narrative. But we still consider them as fabliaux today. Labels, tags are not important. Important is the content and what they actually say, as we'll see now. And so, looking at the groups, by the way, of the corpuses that were created by different scholars, but they identified 147 fabliaux, works being fabliaux, Nick Rogg 160, and Noman, for example, that began in 1983, actually shrank the number to 127, which is not a few overall. Like if you consider this production, it tells you also how big, of course, northern France really was, and also in terms of literary development. So let's just take a look at the fabliaux for what they are and spot essentially like as an overview only themes, styles, techniques. So what are the broader characteristics of this genre? The fabliaux, inspired by and sharing thematic properties with earlier works from Europe, classical world, and even the Orient, right, emerged in France towards the end of the 12th century. There's also an interesting aspect because it was a moment in which the same nobility had sort of locked itself to some extent. It was not so easy to enter the higher spheres. That's also, however, where the third estate is booming, or at least growing very fast at this point. In the 13th century, you have the apex, so probably in the early 14th century, you have the full maturity. Some scholars try to attribute the authorship of the first fabliaux, and so the entire genre, to Jean Bodel, who died in 1210. So the fabliaux would have an origin, probably in the late 12th century. Many fabliaux are anonymous. However, a number of their authors is identified, including, for example, Gauthier Leleu, Henri Dandely, Eustace Damien, Rutebeuf, Baudouin de Condé, and his son Jean, who was also the last known composer of fabliaux. This is interesting because the fabliaux ends, right, with the happy period, you can argue, of the French monarchy in the early 14th century. Right, I explained a bit of this, at least from a monarchic perspective, in that video about, in fact, the transformation of the French monarchy from Philip IV to, I don't remember, but in mid 14th century essentially, and that that shows you how the system gradually began to crack. And so it's also interesting how the fabliaux that you would have imagined to be also sort of a spontaneous one, the third estate, would sort of remain, would have some sort of legacy. And of course there is, like, we're not going to talk about this today, but it's not that direct, it's not that sort of categorically or macroscopically evident. This genre as such does end here. The shortest fabliau is De Preste du Mouton by Ezel or Ezel. It's only 18 lines. In contrast, we find some fabliaux reaching important length of 1,300 lines. Troubert has even 3,000, but it is really standing out as an exception. The majority of fabliaux are between 100 and 300 lines, with an average length of around 250. So they are not particularly short stories, but they, of course, are contained, and you understand from the size how sort of humorous, but to some extent also moralistic, they critical, like satirical even they can be. There is an elaboration stylistically, of course, also in this, around this length, right, within this length. The characters of the fabliaux are definitely from the middle class or peasant society. So Also, not considering the fabliau as a bourgeois genre is a bit difficult, because, of course, just like those who would write belong to the third estate, writing about especially this topics, like they would be as in this sort of more vulgar context, and often also looking at the peasant as a sort of the, it's like, I don't know, jokes today that speak of, I don't know, the lower say characters of society, to say, oh, look at how funny the story is because this guy's dumb, because it's the prototype of the hillbilly or something, and that's so relatable, right? It tells you how sort of wide the the conventional reception of these subjects could be, and of course how also the nobility could enjoy this. As we were saying before, we do not see, however, in Fabliaux knights assuming prominent roles. There could be different explanations. There are also occasional exceptions. For example, in works such as De celle qui se fit foutre sur la force de son mari, which, for those who speak French, is already like very clear in its content, and I will super translate it of she who had herself being fucked on the grave of her husband, which tells you like how also sort of dark this is. Like, yes, it can be funny. There are movies that were made part of this, so it's something that that strikes you because, yes, it's vulgar enough, it's also funny enough and sort of de-dramatizing, but still sort of bitter, right? It's something like, look at this bastards, like it. And so there is some deeper, you immediately understand how critical, after all, of society at the end of the day this really is. This is really typical, not just of medieval literature, but the idea that the miseries of the world are, of course, just like, I warn you, look at what kind of beasts we are, and so just think that, at least you should think that humanity is effed up to the degree that you have to worry about what comes next. It's also in a heavily and, say, completely religious world. And in the aforementioned story of the lady that has intercourse on the tomb of her husband, a knight appears, but in Fabliaux in general, this figure has a secondary role of sort, and often the protagonist instead being his squire, which also again focuses more on this lesser element socially. We see also similarly descriptions of activities associated with the nobility that not really being rare, as we were saying before, but in this sense also a bit stereotypical. For example, Le Chevalier qui recouvrera la mort de sa dame offers an account of a tournament in which a knight will win a lady's love and is identifiable as a fabliau. Why? Because there is a ruse perpetrated by the knight in the second half of the poem. And so that's the actual point. But you see, the context is very, chivalric, the tournament, the winning the love of the lady. But there is like this sort of more cunning aspect to it. By the way, I talked about the sexual implications of medieval tournaments in a video that I think I re-uploaded. Yeah, you should find. Well, okay, it's always published anyway, and I will have to talk more about this because there was a very strongly. We have to talk about the soul, the woman of chivalry, because if one doesn't understand that, doesn't understand the same tournaments. But let's say there were some, of course, more earthly and strongly sexual elements to that as well, always deriving from the archetype, the traditional archetype anyway, such as, I don't know, the lady wearing the knights, her knights, blood-stained clothes after the fight, right? The day after, this kind of thing. There is some space in the Fabliaux for social history that really are funny. Like, they tell you about this third, fourth estate or context, this vulgar lower way. In fact, these people engage in various activities that give you an idea of how the world could be at the time. Working, eating, drinking, so all sort of everyday routines of this third, fourth estate life. The Fabliaux provide descriptions of houses, towns, professions. We see, for example, merchants, millers, farmers were presented with leisure activities. So again, lower things that you don't often hear too much, or not, at least as a context, they would be familiar, of course, to anyone at a time, for people from the higher estates. And they're described in a way that makes you feel like, okay, like we are given for granted here something that is also similar to the way I would imagine these things to a degree. There is a reference to work, food, and drink being very common. And definitely, everything, however, revolves around sex, right? At least this is the single most frequent topic, and in many ways the Fabliaux is about this. And that's where all the humor stems from, the comedic aspect, the betray, the cheating, essentially. That this is the usual idea of the scoundrel that makes it out, not often unscathed, nor success is not that high, but still the drive is very, very much connected with sexual relationships, satisfaction, etc. And sexuality within marriage is also addressed. This is interesting, the history of relations, of families, etc. And sexual satisfaction, again, between spouses is all but unheard of. When marital sex is mentioned at all, it is typically dismissed with a few brief words, or reduced to an emphasis on sex organs rather than the desire of intimacy. And this is interesting because, of course, many marriages at the time, most of them were just combined. There were really striking age divides between the spouses. And this was all part, again, of how society worked, specifically at the time, how work worked, how wealth worked, and where these people came from. So we'll have to make more videos about medieval families to understand this better. And so the idea is that people were sort of forced into these marriages that had this sort of unfair vibe to it. Like, at least people did not love each other. They just had to procreate for practical purpose, and so this sort of bond was criticized and just seen as some sort of punishment, right? Something that these, especially women, because that's the point, like, one escape, right? For, however, sex with other men, extramaritally. And this is really the theme, again, of the Fabliaux, if we want to be honest. Now, a memorable example is the absurd tale told in Les Quatre Souhaits Saint-Martin, where husband and wife, granted 4 wishes, initially have their bodies covered with genitals, and must use their remaining wishes to restore their normal state, which is sort of weird. Now, while seduction or attempted seduction outside of marriage is a far more common occurrence, it is hardly surprising. This is not only due to the widespread use of sexual humor in extramarital settings, but also because the characterization of Fabliaux implies and invites such dalliance. Husbands are, as we were saying before, sort of the bad guys of the situation. Cuckolds, often depicted as cruel and foolish and so sort of deserving being cheated on. naturally imagine this being a very prudish society, actually, right? And so these, even these tales being for some sort of forbidden evasion, like sort of something that would have excited people in general just to hear, and aside from making them laugh, etc. So it was a way to break free, even just with imagination, from, say, the stricter reality of life. I mean, punishments for infidelity, especially of the women, as it actually takes place in Fabliaux, was heavily punished. It was a disgrace. You would have been heavily condemned, etc. Nothing unlike nowadays. That objective has killed also like the meaning behind it all. And wives are portrayed as licentious, with voracious sexual desires. As you'll see, there's actually like a typical medieval misogyny to this, because of course it was archetypal and traditional. The woman was considered like inferior and more prone to, just inferior to man, and prone to this sort of more emotional and less, and more vulgar, right? And sort of stigmatized as a stigmatized aspect. And this doesn't mean, you see, in the lower estates that this was met just with that stigmatization, because of course the lower estates contain themselves the feminine demon, right? And so they're more prone themselves to this sort of lack of regulation of properly even just the instinctive elements, and don't see the point of the institution that controls that, for which ending, right? So this is typical in some aspects of medieval literature, that you read sometimes very sexually charged, very erotic content, and metaphors, and also by authors that could write about theology. And this is really typical of, especially of this era, because we are at the peak of universalism. And the idea is that your completeness, as we were saying before, in a traditional organic sense, was to encompass all knowledge in all its aspects, because if you didn't know, say, even the lowest aspects, you couldn't know the highest ones. And among them, you find this marked misogyny. Right? Think even about how structuralism, like leftism, has sort of tried to, in the 60s, in the 70s, drink a little, to make some idiotic movies inspired to some pieces of medieval literature, for example, about Boccaccio, and trying to serve you the narrative, completely anti-scientific, immoral, like completely and historically literate idea that essentially Boccaccio's novels are some sort of sex tales, because you have to fight prudish, bigoted people, and this guy was just all about, free love and whatever. This is very common, right? There are people who actually believe like that pick history, and reformulate it for people to sell the notion that it was an anti sort of order party of some sort, and that if you actually look at this, it's what all people really wanted to do. They didn't. Aside from the fact that, which make the example of Boccaccio is another story, but because it doesn't even talk about those things. But secondly, these people were normally, and especially later in their lives, very misogynistic. Right? As soon as their spirituality sort of was strengthened, and by age, not because they weren't spiritual before, but in general, they understood the deals of, not being excited by just the emotional side of the story. These works were used to actually criticize, like to show the misery of this world. And there's always a double, of course, thread there. But it doesn't mean that someone trying the way of the left hand is siding with the left hand. This is not really a concept in traditional societies, right? This is a concept that emerged after, in the 19th century, when nationalist and or socialist fortestater there is to say leftistic terroristic regimes kicked in, and lesser people were now springing out like mushrooms because of industrialization, etc. Like we're indoctrinating into to be better controlled, and serving their own lower animal instincts. This has nothing to do with the actual traditional views that were held. It's also the Fabliaux actually has this common thread of adultery running through the work, without being actually meant to sort of instigate this stuff in the first place, but if anything, to sort of criticize or to point out, as we'll see now, certain aspects that were interesting about it, after all, sociologically, psychologically, even sexuologically, and more. Like this is just like life as they were seeing it in a corrupt world, in a fallen human world. Necrog calculated that as many as 63 of his counted 160 fabliaux revolve around love triangles. It's not even dominant, as you understand. Naturally, there are some other sexual fabliaux, say, fabliaux talking about sex that do not revolve around triangles specifically, but it's also a remarkably prominent theme. And as we pointed out before, it's a recurring theme that the participants in these illicit relationships are typically married women and men other than their husbands, right? Rather than husbands and their mistresses. This is interesting because it is some also, you see, this is the beauty of the traditional thinking, as we were saying before, that this topic doesn't actually push for example, a feministic refrain at all. As we will learn now, the fabliaux are actually framed within a heavily let's say, misogynistic, surely moral, right? So these tales are not meant to simply say, okay, well, we just hate the husband, the man, the authority, the leader, the father, whatever. We're just showing how miserable it can get, how women are sort of luxurious and inconstant and sex craving, and there are these sort of lesser elements that creep in essentially from within, like from these estates. You see, these are bourgeois writing, but mostly like they talk about peasants, right, and more sort of squalid contexts than actually what was becoming their own, because people writing stuff were of some significant culture, evidently. They weren't just like average, again, people. They came from, even as third estaters, from sort of good milieu. And this is even, by the way, because seducers are never short in supply. It appears that priests, interestingly enough, are the ones who attempt to seduce married women most frequently. So everybody says, oh my god, the priests, so there's a problem in the church, it's always a scam, whatever. Not only, let's skip the fact that these efforts in the stories are rarely successful, with only, at least according to Necrog's findings, 5 out of 22 instances result in successful seduction. But there actually is not anti-ecclesiastical bias at all, right? The institution of the church is never attacked, differently from women that, as we've seen, are instead misogynistically treated. And they are because, again, tradition tells you why this should be the case. And again, I'm not going to discuss it in this video, but just to make you understand that these fabliaux, even in their lower dimension, are actually written by intelligent people who are trying to make a point about the world and society in a traditional framework. Right, even exceeding. Like again, there's plenty of this literature these years in different European countries, and sometimes you say, but who are these people? Sometimes they were even knights. They were incredibly educated people. They were a bit all of this together, and they would essentially exercise. They would train with these ideas, with these works. Could make big names as well. But again, this was normal. Within the plurality of text, it would be published, because that's also how the world, in their eyes, could be characterized and criticized accordingly through such stories. Besides, there are interesting stylistic choices. The Fabliaux frequently exhibits an interest in language and its uses. It highlights the importance of linguistic nuances as well. There's a small example. Some stories feature puns, such as in Etula, where a man, so it's spelled Estula, right? You know, and a man calls out his dog Etula, which of course in French also means "Are you there?" Right? And in that case, there is a thief hiding in the garden, responding, "Yes, I'm here." And so you understand the double meaning there. They're simple things, but they are funny objectively. Like, it's as, you know, they're cleverer and subtler than they seem. There are also linguistic taboos, other than just moral ones, explored. For example, there's this very interesting fabliau named La Demoiselle qui ne peut parler de foutre, which means the damsel who could not listen to speaking about fucking. This is very interesting because, also psychologically, because it does reflect some real aspects of human thought and behavior. Essentially, there is this young woman that finds the sexual act in itself far less offensive than the word itself. Right? And here, of course, it's not a matter of offense. You see the idea of possession, of full, wanting. Like, it has an incredibly strong role in tradition, and of course, the sexual act in the procreational direction can be more, again, less sanctioned and in fact even legalized at this point, depending on whether it's in the matrimony or not. These fabliau settings, as we've seen, are quite licentious often, but it's, in this sense, something that you just do, you don't speak of. And this literal concept is incredibly relevant for that sense of, let's say, the over-conceptualization of things, as opposed to actually doing being, in fact, a sin, right? And things happen because they have to, but let's say, for example, the same, because here the title is Voir parler, right? So the girl did not want to talk about it because it's vulgar, it's disgusting, just like a young woman of good reputation does not speak about this stuff because what kind of person it is. And then, of course, what happens behind the scene may be different, but it's still like a plus that is negative, and it's even more vile because, say, the speaking part is more vile because it doesn't really find any role in outside of actually doing it, which is quite relatable in today's world, right? What is the issue with, I don't know, pornography or people that don't have sex, that they don't make children? They're just dumbing down their head, right? It's not the mean the problem, it's not the external interference that really trouble. It's what goes on in people's minds, right? And the need to talk sex and be fixated with sex and overly, giving it a dimension that is not natural, right? It feels objectively like a terribly sinful thing. Probably one of the most ones. And of course, here we're talking about medieval France and, this idea of the demoiselle here, that is something, a bit more elevated, at least ideally, than, I don't want to use bad terms here, but you know what I mean. Does actually here expose a paradox. The Fabliaux really does very well in a time of change, actually, in the history of mankind. Again, this is the peak of universalism. This is the peak of like the truest, more felt values, ideally at least conceptualized from a past in which we're much stronger. And then there is the collapse even of these ideas. You see, desecrating, so making satire about this order of things, even just like the one that was established historically, monogamically, is a way to say, look, the system doesn't hold, right? These are the third and the fourth estators. These are the challengers in different ways of those who are at the top, as always. And think about what happened just a few generations later with the Black Death, right? The same Boccaccio is actually a good example of it, because, they say all the story because they escape Florence, devastated by the plague, and they want to speak of life and hymn to that. But there were many movements. Think about the atomists in the Bohemian, during the Hussite period. Think about all the excesses, all the sense of this impending death that is gonna come without you having actually been able to actualize yourself heroically in a world that seemed, in a sense, hopeless compared to what had been the past, and with the sense that the world ages ever more and people are degrading individually and qualitatively in ways that you can't say. So here we don't see much of that throughout the 13th century. That sense of crisis wasn't, there was a sense of crisis, but it was not connected with the collapse of forces, or if anything, it was connected with the emergence of other forces. Of course, it could be seen in the same way, but of course, what happened in the 14th century was much more practically miserable, right? Several fabliaux present humorous anecdotes that play on the distinction between figurative and literal language. For example, in Brunnen, La Vache Prestre, a greedy priest tells a naive couple that whatever they give to God will be returned to them twice over. And so they take his words literally as intended by the priest and obediently give him their cow. However, when the cow returns later, the tables are turned and the priest finds himself on the receiving end of his own deceit. Right? This is actually a simple story, as you understand, but it's actually incredibly relevant as far as tradition is concerned. Because biblically, but also traditionally in general, the idea is that in order to get salvation, of course you should sacrifice yourself entirely. The things that you care about the most, you should sacrifice, because what you're going to get in exchange for that sacrifice is actually much greater than that, much greater than you could imagine. And so it's obvious that this was a narrative used by priests at the time, and this is something actually you don't hear priests saying that much. The concept catholically is always the same, because the traditional meaning of that is always the same. But it's not like, priests are pushing for donations today, like saying, if you do so, well, you will get double as much, like thinking that was the actual thing. At the time, you see, people today have sort of lost this, even Christians, practically. They are so modernized and secularized, and even if they're good Christians, they don't reason just like that anymore. Like, you don't give alms thinking that, telling the truth, well, this could be true, but at least it's not a narrative. You see a negotiational one here between the priest and the faithful, right? It's definitely not a rhetoric that returns. Then, of course, the Christian knows that, how it works. But it's also something you may forget to some extent, or you may think, well, but how is it going to happen, right? And this Fabliaux is quite interesting, because here we're talking about peasants that evidently had a few, and this cow was very important to them. So they initially believe the priest, and then the priest gets fooled in the same way. And this is, of course, like a bit of an anti-traditional smearing of the concept, apparently, because as we've seen, the priests, the individual, covering that office, not the church. Never in the Fabliaux the church is attacked anywhere, right? This is incredibly important to understand. Actually is a scammy guy, but he gets scammed back by his own deceit. And so this is actually a very moral ending, in a way, because it does show that this does happen. There is a bit of funny and vulgar, say, context to the thing. It's not such a highly elevated idea, but this is the point, that it shows that in the third and in the fourth estate, people did actually believe at the time these things. They were discussed. They would believe it in the actually, say, what today we would call it the magical side of the story. And of course here the Fabliaux is less edifying than this version, but it's like saying, yeah, things are that miserable in life, but just be aware that for how naive you are and people do wrongdoing to you, there is always some sort of karma. And this is not immediately evident because we're so overburdened by sin that, of course, giving something just out there is not necessarily the way. This is actually a very interesting concept when you think about the sort of spiritual economy of the world, right? And revenge, in fact, is yet another powerful motivator in many, even in the finest Fabliaux. This is beautiful, terrible at the same time, but sort of very retributive and expressing the sense of, in fact, justice to an extent. The title is L'enfant qui fut remis au soleil. Basically, so that the child was returned to the sun. And basically a woman explains her pregnancy to her husband by recounting that a snowflake accidentally fell into their mouth. And so she took root inside of her, like a seed. And so, well, it is pretty funny and sort of like insulting in a way. So the husband, this actually evidences a kind of strong mind, waits patiently. So the woman has the child and everything, and the guy, the husband, eventually sells this child into slavery. And when the woman, of course, says, well, where's the child? And this disappeared, and the husband says that, there had been an intense sunlight that melted the kid away. Because it had been born out of a snowflake, right? This is terrible and beautiful at the same time. It's possibly my favorite. And we have Le Boucher d'Abbeville. Boucher is the butcher, right, of Abbeville. This butcher seeks refuge in a priest's home, yet takes revenge when the priest denies him shelter. What kind of priest is he? He steals one of the priest's sheep as a consequence, as also the guy was not maybe a gentleman, and in fact that's the third estate. Trading the sheep for lodging, essentially. So he also shares the meat with others. So it seduces the priest's maidservant and mistress, that are two different women, by offering them sheepskins, which he then sells back to the priest himself. So this seems like also like retributive, but as you understand, the retribution, this is a very important traditional principle, can come also through like he was considered less, right? That there are evildoers that can still deliver successfully because of the space that is left, if anything, for this action that is still successful in the measure in which the priest had not essentially done his higher spiritual duty. In an accomplishing way, in a successful way. Naturally, we're not told whether the butcher would have, had it been hosted by the priest, would have not actually done something wrong anyway. But that's the point. That didn't happen. And people at the time cared very much about this here and now, like not much the hypothetical or the abstract, but what actually happened, because they were so focused on the morality of the actions. So the authors of Fabliaux demonstrate also a remarkable fascination with genitalia. As a result, they craft works in which, for example, genitals converse. I mean, it's that, sort of degrading. They multiply, as we've seen also in a previous Fabliaux. They detach from their own owners. They display extraordinary dimensions. These are all themes that recur among the Pelasgian substratum. Like, look at Priapus, or this was a thing really pertaining to the lower estates. So they're also often personified. You see how it's sort of a childish thing, right? They're described in imaginative and inventive ways, and this was a way of venting also, yes, in some sort at least of British society, but we shouldn't be thinking that was, at least in the sense, and especially within these estates. Actually, this seems more like a criticism, a mockery of the same estates, of the same, say, background from which this stuff would actually come. Of course, some things are more serious, like there are great pieces of literature in which, I don't know, think about Reinhard Fuchs, when the fox manages to grow up like, I don't remember what it was, like the dog or whatever, but I mean, there are masterpieces that still indulge in what turns out, in this sense, also actually a very dark and impressive side of the story. Right, there was some heavy moralism in these stories as well. Doesn't matter how sort of weird, or perhaps exactly, it's about that sort of aberration that created the greater problems, because this was seen as just like the split between men and women in the compared to the divine unity in that sexual, let's say, mission that they have, like in terms of reuniting back to the one, but still as humans, feeling that they are humans, that is, they are dirty, they have been chased away from heaven, and so sex is both great and miserable, right? And this is, like, in many ways, like very very much like human condition in many ways. So it would be interesting, as you know, I'm even preparing something about like an entire, say, branch, like a traditional meaning of sex, like in a truly, like, it's a religious sense, which is a topic you don't hear very much discussed. And at the opposite end of the thematic and tonal spectrum, there are, of course, texts that exude subtlety and refinement as well, despite their intention to entertain and frequently addressing themes of seductions as well, that are sort of more, refined, more elegant pieces. Guillaume of Faucon, for example, is nice. There's actually a slur in the meaning here because of the same title. Because the Fabliaux portrays a young man who is deeply in love, is crazy for the wife of his noble master. You see here also the nobility, how, like, it's, this way going around him. And he's not a winner, as you understand. So there is a failure of this lesser status guy, and the wife does actually not reciprocate him, and he falls into some sort of depression. He decides actually to, like all the paranoia and the frustration of rejection, to resort to like almost suicidal solution, like the extreme fasting, nearly unto starvation, as the lady, as we've seen, had rebuffed his amorous advances. Naturally, this is complicated because the guy works for the nobleman, who notices that he was sort of, perishing, and asks his wife the reason why Guillaume was in this pitiful state. And so the woman concocts a fabrication with the purpose essentially of avoiding any potential issues, like she knew but her husband didn't, and she hadn't reciprocated the guy, but she didn't want properly to spark any suspect about him, because she felt pity for him as well. And so she tells her husband that Guillaume has requested his falcon, which was also a way to sort of remunerate him with some compensation for this disappointment. Now, what is funny about this story is it's really linguistics, because most of the stories actually, the falcon, it's a team, like the idea of sometimes there are stories and novels at the same time. They are not sexual, but there's just this guy and this girl and nothing really happens. But here it's a matter of prestige, of power. The falcon is also a great deal of symbol of power that the guy entrusted by nobleman. This falcon flies high, brings the imperium, bears all a traditional meaning. The narrative of this Fabliaux is very similar to a lay, or an episode from a courtly romance, because this is essentially where the story takes place. But again, the funny thing is that in French, like this faucon, so the falcon, actually means false cunt, which is, of course, referred to the lying lady. And so this brings to laugh, and as the consequence of her ruse. And so she was like a lying whatever. And her husband, at that point, really demands that she grant Guillaume what he has asked for, which is the twisted turn of it all, and it makes it even more, even worse, because up to that point, really nothing controversial had really occurred. But you understand how the tension also mounts up here. This is, it's difficult not to relate to someone that, to the idea of desire, right? And lack of reciprocation. It's actually a serious issue. And so this you see, this is an elegant story, but it has this double meaning, and it's just like a big joke that sort of makes you laugh in the end, but it's also sort of heavy if you think about that. As we were saying before, there's a bit of anti-clericalism, but also not really anything ideologically against the church or Christianity at all. The relation with women is more complex, right? There's definitely misogyny, as it was traditional at the time. It should be pointed out, of course, that this does not mean that all women are bad in the stories at all. On the contrary, some female characters are also like the Falcon Dane, actually, in matter of wit and more. Like they're really intelligent, and many are, and others are also virtuous, right? So this is obvious. They are going to play that role, and depending on the circumstance and the story and how they interact with the other characters. There is this ambivalence as well, of standards, like in the Bourgeois d'Orléans, for example, you have this woman committing adultery while her husband is being brutally beaten nearby, yet the Fabliaux treats her with sympathy. Right. There's no doubt, however, that the majority of the Fabliaux has like a much less favorable view of women, who are often condemned for their lasciviousness and deceitfulness. There is an ample criticism to men as well. Like they are criticized, of course, for being foolish enough to trust women, which kind of makes sense in the dynamic here. Also, like simply allowing themselves to be led astray by them. How relatable is this? I am actually extremely low in agreeableness, and this is part of the reason why I'm not married yet. So there is a circular mechanism for which, of course, the condemnation is extended to women as well. They also are too easily led astray themselves by, again, lascivious pretenders, etc. Perhaps the worst female portrait is drawn in the Fabliaux La Dame Esquoyée, where a wife's strong will and presumption are attributed to her having testicles, which is not really meant as like she was a transvestite, but the fact that literally like she would have been like the one wearing the pants in the family. And this is what was attributed to that sort of hormonal say unbalance unitly and this aberration. And of course this metaphor serves as a pretext also for physical punishment, because she's actually removed the offending items, and so it's that wild and raw. You see how dark these themes after all really are. I mean, of all the ones that we really discussed, like it's not much just, I don't know, amorous promiscuity. There is something really bad going on, right? This is the underlying theme of it all, like sin, human misery, this sort of board upside down, dysfunctional reality, right? And again, you need to have that in a cultural horizon to sort of fuel also an idea of how things should actually go. Right? This is what we should recover, like a bit like the entire sense of politics, like how the various layers really occur. Like again, the traditional society by caste is offered very, say, didactically this kind of hierarchy. There's all some sort of threat. For example, the aforementioned woman in the Fabliaux is threatened with the repetition of the same surgery. Let's say, had she regrown her attributes, her male attributes. So this is interesting because it reinforces the traditional roles through probably a moral, but let's say transcendental idea of how things can change. If you think about it today, we shouldn't think that from one side it's positive, of course, to reinforce the idea that things can't be changed, but you can't underestimate how transcendental reality is meant traditionally. I mean, the idea is that if women start wearing pants too much, things will change at a much deeper level than just that, right? My great-grandmother believed this, like she said, the day women will wear trousers, like the world will end, right? She actually died late enough, maybe not to see where she lived, but say women with pants, but let's say they already existed. But how can't you see that she was right at the end of the day? The Fabliaux exhibit a remarkable range in both theme and technique, as we've seen. This is also obvious considering that, as we've seen, there are 150 of them, also spread over a century and a half, substantially. As you understand, some of these texts are little more than crude jokes. But they're all part of a broader system. And other fabliaux are instead rather sophisticated and nuanced. And they have also, as we've seen, like a subtle humor. It's never just the dirty joke or whatever. It's the deeper meaning. It's what makes you think, right? Why would they come up with these specific ideas? As we try to observe today, there is always some deeper point to it. Some fabliaux include moralizing messages, often seemingly unrelated to the preceding narrative, while others tell their story briefly and abruptly conclude. So of course they were written in many different ways, even just for the way they were passed down, this maybe were just stories that these people had heard, and surely they were connected with so many different aspects of everyday life we can't properly connect. There were stories circulating, songs, right? Everything was part of that world, and so the fact that they were being written down is also a bit actually the end of a world that used to spread them sort of in different ways, and that were probably derived from the lower estate. Because at least there was some poetry in it, was some sort of, look, these are sort of weird, they are offensive, whatever, but there is some deeper meaning to them. The majority of the fabliaux are simple, concise. They also do not integrate external material, whereas a few invest considerable effort in establishing character or tone for different purpose that serves the narrative, but it's just also aesthetical and artistic, poetic. And despite their differences in perspective on topics such as women, priests, nobles, and storytelling methods, these works generally concur on their primary goal, to delight and entertain their audiences. Right, and again, they were being preserved, they were being collected. At a certain point, they stopped being recorded, as we've seen, and that's sort of sociologically the most interesting aspect of this, I would think, especially considering the chronology that obviously overlaps with those major issues that were going on in the Western world. Although the fabliaux authors may draw logical moral conclusions from their anecdotes, their primary objective remains entertainment. As we've seen, the content is so thought-provocative and very often dark and sort of, devoid of morals at least if not in this sort of shock effect, and so actually making a point but in an indirect way. And often, let's say, this entertainment, in fact, comes with, in a broader sense, not just or specifically humor. Again, as we've seen, yes, it's humor, but it's sort of dark. Sometimes it's even unpleasant. It's sort of funny, but it's still, there's something powerfully negative into it. So this is actually what you can connect the enduring success of the fabliaux as well, right? And so the mere fact that somebody connected them with Chaucer or Boccaccio, they surely had, of course, a wide knowledge about the stories in their own respective context, and of course, like between England and Italy, like French literature was a very important thing, and so the fabliaux would have been known and sort of part of a broader tradition of humor, of sort of lower content, of specific, seen messages that were just conceived more broadly. And in this tension, in fact, in this contrast, right, this allowed the fabliaux not to disappear in the midst of the unfortunate loss of wide amount of material created in medieval times, but being preserved and surviving to the 20th century. Right, and so we are still talking about them today and fundamentally enjoying them for what they are, for their provocation. And of course, as always, the most difficult thing is to correctly frame the content, not thinking that this is just there for reasons that are very new. Just the last couple of hundred years, this sort of rooting for evil or for the destruction of society or anti-traditional values for the simple sake of it, not because there is actually a point, not because there is anything to be liberated from or whatever. This is just some, okay, we just think that and we go with it for no other reason than pain at the end of the day, unfulfillment, and all what of course remains pretty connected with failure, of the individual. And also trying to understand, of course, what this could mean for them, like in their specific context, right? In their system of belief, which is different from ours, but is also deeper for this. Like it's not like you can really see much of it without some guidance, some interpretation. Just today we try to make the points that you have seen, and I believe that once you get the fundamentals, you can also orient yourself in medieval literature. I don't make too many videos about medieval literature. I think I haven't even yet created a playlist about that. I created something that is called like art history. It's a huge playlist, but every once in a while, of course, it's very important to talk about that, because it here it is, art history. 28 videos. Well, it's actually, oh well, yes, because it actually, yeah, there's art in general, architecture, literature, even construction materials, like how, and music as well. It's an interesting topic. Naturally, I don't specialize really in this kind of content, but I sort of care, of course, about covering it from a strictly historical point of view, because this is exactly what fundamentally you get from the say it's not talking about this case literature per se, right, but a series of issues fundamentally that are also sort of relatable, right? You're not talking about some abstract system that you don't understand anymore. Many people, of course, are severed from the actual traditional knowledge as we know, but it's not like they wouldn't understand the actual references here. So for today I stop it here. We'll keep talking, of course, about medieval French literature, medieval literature in general. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.